So welcome. Thanks, Kacper, for joining us. How should we look at your background? You're a postdoc currently in Oslo, is that right?
Yeah, Center for Research on Extremism in Oslo at the University of Oslo, yes.
Okay. Yeah, so I mean, thanks for coming on. I just wanted to get a little bit of an introduction going on this issue, because I know everyone's seeing the headlines, the 5-figure numbers that are floating around. The president, I think this morning, said something like 16,000 people are, quote, already on the way. As usual, there's going to be a lot of policy discussion about what this means, legally speaking, for Canadian government, for the British government, for Western governments, whether these numbers are actually accurate. And you're the person I know who's been looking at this issue the most in depth and for the longest time. So I kind of wanted to just chat with you a little bit to provide a bit of background for people who don't know what this issue is and so on. So I mean, I guess first of all, how are you? I know it's been a little difficult.
Yeah, absolutely, Omar. Well, it's been difficult because obviously, I'm Polish originally. I'm not in Poland at the moment, but my students, Ukrainian students, essentially are either trapped on the other side, or are basically fighting on the other side, or are helping out from the Polish side of the border. So that's how it touches me. We've got Ukrainian friends. My family's got Ukrainian friends, because it's not difficult. The Ukrainian community in Poland is huge.
Right.
It's been growing for the last decade or so, and they're everywhere. So you all know Ukrainians and vice versa, and then it touches us deeply. Plus, probably long before 2014, but especially after 2014, there is this kind of recognition in my country that Ukraine deserves our support, and if it's not them, then we might as well be next. So essentially, if you combine all these features together, you get what you get. And then there's more than 600,000 refugees from Ukraine in Poland, and the number is growing. The response has been phenomenal, but it is tiring in a sense for everyone. I think it is challenging, and it will be, but we've been doing great. The one photo that I always remember is the app, that you can actually download an app that tells you, where to go to, actually with whom to stay. And then the whole map of Poland lights up. That there are offers anywhere and everywhere. You can literally pick up a town, you can pick up a village, basically, and there's what you're going to stay. But the funny thing is that many of the Ukrainians who are going out, they have it organized already. So it's a kind of like a pre-arranged, and that tells you about the depth of the connections. So when you're asking how we are, not great. I'm trying to help people out. I'm trying, helping out with some humanitarian efforts, and obviously I'm out there in the information domain, trying to get the message out. And thank you for the for the invite, and also for the chance to chat about it, because I also get a lot of stuff which is weird, so to speak. Starting off with this question of which I got today on a few occasions actually from Western media: is Ukraine Nazi? Please tell our readers, our followers, our viewers, are they Nazis? And I'm kind of, well, I'm tired, but I have to respond to these requests and questions, because I see this as a part of, this is what I can do, right? This is the best I can do, and I'm, trying my best.
Yeah, I mean, I've been perturbed by that question also, because it as you, I think, tweeted a while ago, it does seem to be kind of following along Putin's talking points to kind of this denazification of the Ukraine and so on. But I mean, if we can focus on that a bit, I mean, how can we talk a bit about like far right sentiment in the Ukraine, how far it goes back, what are the grievances that are pushed by some of these groups, networks, individuals? How big a problem is it from your perspective?
Amar, I would say it goes like this. In terms of the scale and the size and the success, it doesn't differ that much from the scale and the size and the success of the far right in almost any European country, to be honest. So, but somehow we're less alarmed when we're discussing the other European countries, whereas in this case we are, and we'll probably get to that. But essentially, historically, or not so, even not historically, it's pretty modern stuff, that the most successful far-right outfit is called Svoboda, Liberty, the political party, which is out there, which got around, something around 10+% of the vote in the election. That's a measure of the sentiment. But at the same time, Amar, this is the funny one. We are in a political space, just like in the Russian political space, where this term political technology operates. And political technology is this operation in which you can, for example, invent political parties and basically, fake them till they make it, in a sense. And that's for a reason. And Svoboda, which was very much a far-right, like solid far-right party, started drifting towards radical right, and suddenly found itself as a media darling in Ukraine, at the time when Ukraine was run by the pre-Maidan president, Viktor Yanukovych. So, the guy who was deposed in 2014. And that was for a reason, because Svoboda was supposed to take the votes away from conservative parties, which were challenging, or right-wing, center-right-wing parties, which were challenging Viktor Yanukovych. And Svoboda was given ample TV space on TV channels controlled by oligarchs, friendly with this pro-Russian president, so that the party grows and it takes away the vote from the allegedly pro-Western center-right. And that happened. That happened. They were basically being portrayed as the biggest opposition, although they had like 2% in the polls, then they rose to around 10. And guess what? The plan was it looked as if the plan was, okay, when they're successful, we're going to turn around and say, oh, it's the fascists, and we're fighting the fascists now. So the biggest political success of the far right in Ukraine, like electorally and widely, was basically a result of a political technology operation. So I wouldn't read that much into it. Now, you are dealing with a country, as in anywhere in Central Eastern Europe, which is basically conservative. It's more conservative, certainly more conservative than Canada. So the default option, your default voter is not center left, socially liberal, economically slightly social democratic, let's put it this way. No, your default voter is center right wing. I would put it this way. Now, so you're operating in a completely different environment. So even though I'm telling you nationalism and far right is not a big thing, that does not mean that everyone is on the soft left and then that there is a wide liberal space. But that does not mean, and it does not equal the fact that Ukrainians should be termed as Nazis or stuff like that. There's one more element to it, and I'll finish off with this. Historically, this argument of Nazis, nationalists and stuff like that, that is something that Russia has thrown at Ukrainians for like decades, especially from 1945 onwards, when basically it controls the whole of Ukraine and suddenly starts saying, right, whoever is against the Soviet Ukraine, there's basically you're just a neo-Nazi fascist, you're siding with some Ukrainian nationalists who flirted with Nazi Germany, and I stress the word flirted with Nazi Germany throughout the Second World War. There's this cementing of this narrative that, oh, you're just the children and grandchildren of these guys. You're against the real Ukraine, the Soviet Ukraine, the Ukraine which is bound to Russia, which is connected. And it's an operation that, reinterprets the history of Ukraine by saying, oh, you've always been with us. We've always been together. We're a brotherly nation. And, not really, to be honest, but it serves a purpose. And there are selective elements of this, picked and chosen by the Russians. And there is a group of voters in Ukraine up until, I guess, a week ago, because now they're all they're all Ukrainian nationalists now, and certainly Ukrainian patriots, who were basically saying, we're in the same space with Russia. We share a lot culturally. We speak the same language, or almost the same language. We shouldn't confront them. We do business with them and stuff. They saw it as a natural partner, but after what happened a week ago, I guess that goes out of the window. So in this sense, it's on really flimsy ground. It's been used by Russians, but funnily enough, and you love this, it's also been used as a political cleavage inside the country. I don't know if some of the, it's a nice one. 20 years ago, when Ukraine had this first revolution, the Orange Revolution, you would have these map of Ukraine split into two. Here is a pro-orange, Western, Ukrainian-speaking liberal part, and here is a blue, Russian-speaking, non-liberal, autocratic, blah, 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 blah. And guess what? It looked ridiculous on the pages of Western newspapers, and it looked ridiculous in the country, but some people, especially some of the political class, liked it, because it was a nice political cleavage. I mobilized voters here, right, and you mobilize your voters there. And this legitimized the narrative on one hand, oh, you're just a bunch of autocratic, xenophobic, backward Easterners, and then the others were getting the criticism of you're just a bunch of, pro-Western, but in reality, post-Nazi guys who can be slurred as well. And now, after the first war in 2014, if you like, I mean, not the first war, the one that started in 2014, and especially now, this is being rehashed. This is the case, because historically that's been the case against Ukraine, that those Western Ukrainians are just a bunch of fascists, and that they want to sell the country out, and they just want to sell it to some probably, to some Western investors and then companies and stuff like that, and line their pockets. It's been there. Now it's being rehashed. It's a flimsy ground. It's it's actually sad that allegedly an empire such as Russia has to use propaganda like this to justify its the biggest political decision it took since early 1990s. That tells you how flimsy. If that's the best you've got narrative wise, you're in trouble, and Russia is in trouble on this front.
I mean, speaking of 2014, maybe we can sit there for a second. What for people who don't know the background, I mean, what happened leading up to 2014? You had Viktor Yanukovych stepping down. What do you see as the significance of that moment for what we're seeing now?
I mean, look, it probably the significance is growing because apparently Russia tries to install Yanukovych back. The president who fled the country in 2014. He wasn't deposed. He fled the country, although we don't know what would happen with him had he stayed, to be honest. So I guess that's one thing. But it looked like this. Ukraine, to some extent, was standing at a crossroads, and time has come to declare oneself a bit more in economic and trade terms, whether you're actually going to be a part of a pro or Russia-sponsored, Russia-dominated economic union, or you want to sign with the European Union. That was the choice, more or less. And Ukraine seems to be making this choice throughout 2012 and 2013, and then at the last moment walks away from a deal, from the association agreement with the European Union. And then the protest starts. They're small, but then the police beats up some of the students, some of the protesters, and that enrages people. You have this. It's almost like an Egyptian moment, Amar, if you don't mind me saying. It's almost like like the Arab Spring, that nothing is supposed to happen because they've got this from the point of view of the government, and then there are some images being beamed, and there are some mistakes being made by the by the police chiefs in the Ministry of Internal Affairs in Kiev, and you're in trouble. And then you've got more and more protesters.
Police brutality will do that every time, right?
Exactly. But I mean, in this specific case, it gets amplified by the political grievance, and also the fact it's not just that Yanukovych didn't sign the association agreement. That would be too little. Yanukovych constructed something which is called Simya, the family, and it worked like Hosni Mubarak's family in Egypt. Really. It was basically, you had a pyramid where each and every local hack had to donate money to the upper echelons of the Simya until it reached the very, 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 very top. I think the mechanism resembled the Egyptian mechanism, to be honest, and that's not a compliment to Ukraine in this case. Let's be, because you're talking about a country that basically sits on the border of the European Union, and it's not working well. You have more and more people actually leaving the place. It's not growing as fast as it could, and it's looking at its Western neighbors like Poland, Slovakia, Hungary, and Romania, and saying, well, I mean, what did we do wrong? Where did we get it wrong that we're not where they are? And then suddenly, you know, you've got all these political, you know, machinations around the signing or not signing of the European, the association agreement, which was meant to be kind of like a ticket to ride that gives us a chance to move in a certain direction. And then, you know, rest is history, Amar. You know, the only people who died ever under the flag of the European Union were people in Kiev in, you know, 2013, 2014, because that's how they saw it, you know, that we're gonna, it's either this or that. And that is also helpful, paradoxically, to the propaganda coming from the other side. It's the West who's pushing you in certain direction, right? It's not so great. Plus, and that was the funniest one, the West is both neo-Nazi and gay. That was the element of it. I mean, that was the one which was kind of like, you know, literally you had Yanukovych speaking to his ministers like that, and his, you know, police commanders briefing the police force that, you know, you'll go out and you'll beat up the gay and the neo-Nazis protesting in the streets of Kiev. And I can only, you know, I can only imagine the faces of, you know, the looks in the faces of those policemen, because, you know, that's pretty conflicting evidence.
Can we talk a bit about the volunteer regiments, because that, I don't know if it existed to that extent pre-2014. You had a whole host of volunteer regiments pop up. Is there a sense of how many regiments and platoons? I've heard estimates as high as 36 or 30, you know, 36 different regiments that have that were volunteer regiments. What was the need for them? Why into the 2014? What was their purpose? Is it just kind of local groups that picked up weapons and got together, or is it something more formal?
Yeah, Amar, good point. Volunteer battalions, they came about in early 2014, essentially largely out of the Maidan revolution, or literally out of the Maidan, the square in downtown Kiev. I would say this, you know, I was working in Warsaw at the time, and I remember there was a list circulating around Warsaw at the time of the needs of the Ukrainian army, which is now standing firmly against the Russians. But in early 2014, it actually needed everything. It needed socks. That's how bad it was. It was downgraded. Yanukovych, the president, was downgrading it on purpose. Its leaders, you know, the ministers of defense were, you know, both Ukrainian and Russian nationals. So you can imagine how concerned they might have been with actually the army doing anything. And the volunteer battalions come to the fore when you see things that are happening in Crimea, you know, where the Russian army basically moves in and without a shot being fired, although that's also the command of the Ukrainian army, do not, you know, oppose them, not so that you don't create a massacre, but people are, let's say, let down, enraged, unhappy. They're doubting whether any state institution is able to perform. You know, after the years of this, you know, this kleptocratic corruption by this family of Yanukovych, Simya, and, you know, the volunteer battalions are basically filling the void. You know, that this type of warfare, Amar, I mean, you can see it in many parts of the world, but this kind of almost like, you know, bottom-up type of, today we would say militia, but, you know, in the past we've probably used different terms, but this has been a specific part, you know, particularity of that very region for hundreds and hundreds of years. You know, the whole, you know, the organization of the Cossacks, the proto-Ukrainians, it's the classic kind of chaotic, bottom-up, I don't follow your orders because I have my orders, kind of, you know, my way or highway, the kind of cliche, which is completely not true, but I mean, this is the cliche understanding. This harks back to that type of a sentiment, which has been there. And, you know, we like to improvise. Central Eastern Europeans and Ukrainians are pretty good at improvisation. And sometimes, you know, they're really, you know, they're champions of the world at times. And that was it, you know. Plus, this is the funny one. It's the oligarchs who are chipping in. They're saying, okay, I have my interests, my business interests in Eastern Ukraine, and I need these to be protected from upheaval, you know, whatever it is, Russian invasion, you know, protest or whatever. And okay, so here's a group of guys who want to do stuff. I'm giving them money. That's how it worked. This is another impulse. You have the political impulse coming out of the Euromaidan. You have the oligarchs coming in. You have the resentment. You have the kind of letdown of the poor performance, or poor performance of the state, actually, not so much even the army, but the state. And people are saying, look, the only thing we can do is this, and we get together, and they are crowd-funded, you know, volunteer units, militia units, and there's dozens of them, Amar. You know, some of them function for barely a few weeks, and then there are more bigger ones. Eventually, all of them but one are taken on the payroll of either the Ukrainian military, but especially the Ukrainian National Guard. Some of them are kind of completely disbanded, merged together, and stuff like that. And I think they do stand in 2014 and fight. But I think, people try to rewrite the history saying that they were the ones who held off, the Russians from further advance, or the separatists, inverted commas. But that doesn't give full justice to the performance of the Ukrainian army, which was then picking up. It was getting better. But in certain cases, yes, these volunteer battalions definitely made a difference, and a whole kind of almost like a movement around them. Socio-political movement kind of arises. A mythology arises that volunteer men. This from all around the world. We stood. We defended, therefore now we have a claim to the state. We should be more prominent in the state. And this is the part of the whole discussion that we've been having since 2014, like, okay, are they militias? Are they the Ukrainian versions of Hezbollah or Hamas or stuff like that, which is completely off the mark, because they never had such power. There's no religion there. That's the first thing. The second thing is they never had such power. And funnily enough, the ones which are the most notorious, and I'm sure you're going to ask me about Azov, they are kept on a really short leash, and there is a really strong hand of the state kind of limiting what they can and what they cannot do, and how they can behave, and what is seen as acceptable and non-acceptable. But yeah, they do arise, and they respond to us. It's a response to a certain need, if you like.
What determined, because you said every one of these kind of 36 or so volunteer battalions was eventually incorporated into the National Guard, right? And so you said all except one. Which one was that?
Which is the remnants of the right sector, another
right sector.
infamous battalion. Yeah.
So I'm curious, even with these battalions that arose kind of out of the Ukrainian far right scene, is there a sense, there's been some debate about this, whether even the individuals who joined these movements, whether they had actual ideological affinity to the far right, or did they join for some other reason? And if they did join for other reasons other than allegiance to far right ideology, what are some of the other reasons why people would choose far right battalions over other battalions?
So I'll maybe start with the non-ideological ones, Amar, if you don't mind. Sure. The non-ideological ones is it's by accident. You really joined because my mates joined it, or I basically stumbled upon them, and they had offices around the Maidan in downtown Kiev. All these organizations had. Then there is with Azov, it also worked like that. They present themselves as the real deal from day one, that we're actually going to take the fight to the enemy. There is no messing about. And thirdly, I think for the non-ideological reasons is the fact that, imagery matters. And these groups had good logos and a pretty concise and then neat slogans and statements, so to speak. And it was kind of cool. There is hipster far right, if you believe it or not. There used to be hipster far right in Kiev. It was really when the turbo patriotic scene, if I could put it this way, drinking soya latte. If you can imagine that, it does exist. So these are the elements, So the kind of it was partly accidental. It was kind of by recommendation. It was because they were seen as the ones, they were seen as the ones who actually took the fight to the police force around Maidan. So yeah, it's fair play to them, people were saying. Now, ideological, yeah, sure. There was a component and a segment of people who joined for that reasons, automatically with certain mindset, kind of coming out of nationalistic organizations or far-right organizations in Ukraine, saying, okay, here is our chance to transform, our small, not taken seriously, underfunded, whatever, groups and grouplets and organizations into something serious. It's a ticket to ride. Now we can be what we always dreamt about. We're going to get the guns, we're going to get the uniforms, and we're actually going to fight. And Azov is born in such a manner, essentially a group of, hooligans, if you like, from Kharkiv, which is now being shelled by Russian artillery.
Who were released from prison.
Yeah, exactly, released from prison as well. and suddenly transformed into, defenders of Ukraine. It's a nice transformation. And, I kind of laugh at people who say that, oh, they're now gonna run with this heroic myth. Well, yeah, because it's partly true. That is the thing. It's the funny thing is that they're probably the most concise and the most successful in terms of packaging themselves. These other units didn't have that much of an ideology, so they could be molded into, National Guard Battalion number 5 without any further, great backstory. This is about the backstory from day one. And it was allowed, and this is probably the issue that, you can always ask Ukrainians about, and they hated it. And I've met some who resented not doing it, that not enough was done to challenge the mythology. Not enough was done to challenge the kind of, this heroism, but also the graphics, the name, the logos, and then the kind of, the fact that its members, well, at times spoke anti-governmental stuff, anti-state, if you like, stuff, and yet they were tolerated to remain within the broader, security sector and underneath the umbrella, as if, some scraps were given to them so that they keep Stamm. That was the arrangement. That's why we keep on talking about them.
Some people pointed to the 2014-15 parliamentary elections to make the point that there was actually very little far-right sentiment in post-2014 Ukraine, right? I think something like 13 out of 423 MPs could maybe be described as far-right or ultra-nationalist, etc. Do you think, first of all, the election is a good gauge for guessing far-right sentiment in the Ukraine? Or are you worried that this kind of sentiment might be on the rise?
Obviously now that this sentiment is absolutely rising, because you just want to hit back at the Russians. So there's this is turbocharged anyway. And having this discussion with the Ukrainian now, that they're just gonna say, please stop. It was hard before the war, or the reignition of the war. Now it's way harder. Now, in terms of like pure far right, the kind of extremes of the, obviously they it would be wrong to say that they never existed. It would be wrong to say there was no anti-Roma, anti-LGBT violence, because it was always there. It was probably more than in quite a few places in Europe. But funnily enough, Amar, people don't, I'll put it in the context of Russia, because I think in this sense they could be compared, because these scenes, the Ukrainian and the Russian one of the far right, they really coexisted together. Same language, same music, same interests, same meeting points and stuff like that. And Azov's from Kharkiv, that's very close to Russia, so they really got on well together. And we always talk about the far right in Ukraine, but we hardly ever talk about the Russian one. And the Russian far right, or the extreme right, if you to be more specific, it kind of murdered 500 people in the first 2 decades of the 21st century. I don't think the Ukrainian far right murdered 1/20th of that. And not to say that there was no issue, not to say there aren't ugly things coming out of that scene. So it's kind of, it's also the issue of perspectives, which kind of puts the whole, Putin narrative of denazification in a rather interesting context, if you don't mind me saying that. But yeah, the elections, on one hand, they are like a reader. You can read the situation, but then again, you have these political technology operations around the elections. Plus, somebody once told me, a former deputy minister, won't name him, won't say which ministry of Ukraine, once told me, in Ukraine, the politics used to be all about money. Therefore, if you wanted this, you could invent it and fake it and balloon it to something, and then say, it was just a joke, literally. So I don't think we have the mechanisms to kind of gauge this properly from a Western perspective. But I would say it is overblown, and I know why. I think it's because 2014 happens, and there are lots of journalists out there in Ukraine. And I think the members of these volunteer battalions, some of them didn't get the memo to behave themselves. And you have these absolute, I'm sorry to say, quite often clowns you know, Sieg Heiling, showing the swastikas, talking about Hitler. You know, they were, you know, they were guys from the right sector, you know, talking some ridiculous stuff to some Polish journalists without realizing that they're Polish and they're Ukrainian nationalists, so they should really kind of mind their words. Yet they would, but this was being beamed in 2014, and it was amplified, it was picked up, it was also used by the other side. That's not to say it's not there, but the scale of it was like made into something which was, you know, okay, there's a Nazi Hezbollah in Ukraine, or there's a Nazi Al Qaeda preparing, you know, foreigners to send them back to do terrorist attacks all around the world in the name of some far right global ideology. But that wasn't the case.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like the way to sometimes get Western media attention is to touch on this issue, right? Is because as soon as you tell somebody that there are Canadians leaving or that there are Americans leaving, it's almost like the entirety of the war gets put on the shelf, and this becomes the only issue that people are concerned about, because now you're talking about us, and now you're talking about our national security and our security potentially, and so that the dynamic changes when you include kind of the foreign fighter component, right? And
yeah, you know the drill, Amar. You know the drill. It's the same. It's the same. You know, it's the same rationale here, and it's exactly like that. Like that basically Atomwaffen division wanted to join us off. That's the only thing. No, they didn't, and no, they didn't succeed. But you know, for a time, it looked as if that was the case, and I was like, you know, looking at it, saying, "Oh Jesus, like please no."
So Zelensky came on this morning and said 16,000 people are on the way. I'm curious if what that intake looks like. Do we keep track? Do we do the Ukrainians keep track of the different nationalities that are coming in? You know, we had the ISIS entrance forms, for example, when the ISIS foreign fighter phenomenon was happening. Do you get a sense that there's a kind of bureaucracy behind intake, or is it just going to be kind of chaotic because of the war situation?
I think, Amar, there is, you know, when President Zelensky says 16,000, I think that's a reliable number in terms of people who actually expressed an interest to Ukrainian embassies, especially in Europe and maybe north, you know, on the other side of the Atlantic. So that makes sense. But now, out of the 16,000, how many of them actually proceeded to forward their documents to those embassies? Because there is like a questionnaire which you fill in, and then you're supposed to kind of, you know, there are appendices to actually attach. So maybe that's the number of people who actually got in touch, and that sounds about fair, because there's like a 300 here, 400 here, you know, 200 here. But now, how many are actually going to make the trek? That's a completely different ball game. I mean, you would be also way more better positioned than me to actually to guess how many out of the initial, you know, group will make the journey. You know, I think in one interview I said, you know, divided by 10, and then out of the ones who go, probably also divided by 2, because then something's going to happen on the way, or you know, they're going to be in different roles, blah 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 blah. So that is a nice number as far as the initial assessment. And I mean, look, Ukrainians are doing this for PR purposes as well. It's a beautiful thing to say, you know, that many of you expressed an interest and they're going to be joining us, and I cannot blame them, you know, as someone who's looking at it from such a close kind of, you know, perspective. But we'll see, you know, we'll really see what actually transpires on the ground. Now, if there's yes, they're trying to put a kind of like a bureaucratic hand on it, but I can also imagine situations in which fighters will go there on their own, bypass the embassies, and basically go to Lviv, where there is a center that is supposed to process them. But then again, there will be processed there, not at the embassy, but processed there. But probably some of them will even bypass that and go straight in, although that would be really foolish. So in a sense, Ukraine's trying to put it, you know, to really kind of like, you know, keep the not only the pulse, measure the pulse of this, but actually control it. But as you said, you know, as the war progresses, we don't know what exactly is going to transpire. And there already were some kind of like, you know, farcical situations in which some foreigners wanted to join this territorial defense unit, because they would be joining territorial defense units. But the army, but, you know, not the army, but, you know, the kind of like volunteer formations. but they're under the control of the state, and so that's why we kind of really shouldn't really be calling them foreign fighters. They're really volunteers, because fighters are supposed to be associated with a kind of non-state formation. Some people say that. I get the point. But there were already some farcical situations when someone wanted to join that unit and then basically got lost in the fog. It was night. Batteries went down, and I couldn't call them. But hey, here's another unit, so let's just join these guys. It can be like that. Coming back to the point, Amara, that I said, lots of improvisation, and Ukrainians are really good at it.
Do you get the sense that the Ukrainian military is going to allow foreign volunteers to be on the front line, or is it going to? Are they going to try to urge them into being cooks and medics and things like that?
Yeah. Of course, we've seen that. I think in 2014 they were quite good at actually using them. The volunteer battalions were keen to put these guys to the test and then to kind of have their skills at the forefront. Some were frustrated, but mostly I heard good opinions, if I could put it this way. So I think they're going to use them this time. Obviously, pretty conscious of the fact that any captured by the Russians will be used as a propaganda tool for the Russian government. But I think there is the track record so far with much smaller numbers is not so bad, and I think they're gonna do it again, especially if these guys will come with certain qualities. And I think especially the ones that were highlighted in some early media articles, like, by Chris Miller for BuzzFeed, former special forces guys. Yeah, well, that they're going to be put to use, maybe even as trainers more. So maybe not fighting, but actually preparing those forces. So yeah, we'll see. But, their track record was way better than the other side of the war, when, the many ones that I spoke to, on the separatist side, they actually hated it, because they said, we're manning checkpoints. It's not what we should be doing here. We came to fight. I actually basically gave up my job to be here, and I'm basically manning checkpoints and doing some stage performances for Russia Today. So that was frustrating for them.
I'm curious, as a extremism researcher, whether you are worried at all about any of the foreign fighter issue or foreign traveler issue. Like, is there a chance they're going to? Because I can tell you, the fear amongst researchers in the West is that there's a chance that these guys are going to join extremist battalions there, get some training, come back, launch attacks. That's the general kind of conversation around the foreign fighter issue, right? And so I'm wondering if you see it the same way, whether you have other concerns that we're not maybe thinking about, or whether you have no concerns, or whether they're just going to go fight and come back home.
Yeah, Amar, I won't say I have no concerns, because obviously, men traveling around the world to pick up guns, there's always a concern. But obviously, I'm not 100% impartial observer, let's be honest, because of where I come from. And, I understand the Ukrainian point of view, which is basically it's a roll of the dice, and saying, if I can have such support, if I can have such guys, I'm going to have them, and I don't worry. So that's the Ukrainian position. So let's try to understand the Ukrainian position. I understand, I've seen my colleagues, your colleagues, discuss this, especially on Twitter. I've refrained from challenging them, because they're right. If I'm sitting somewhere in the West, I don't want, for example, hundreds of my people to go and fight anywhere for anything. That's a fair point. That's a fair point. So I get that. But, at the same time, at the end of the day, it's a bit like I worry what I'm going to have for dessert tomorrow, but I'm not sure what's going to be for dinner tonight. That's the kind of, dilemma that we have here.
Yeah.
In terms of the challenges, I think, Amar, I have a project at CIREX, Uni of Oslo, where I'm supposed to, I'm not doing that, because I'm looking into the current mobilization, but I'm looking at the afterlives of those fighters from the kind of, let's say, first wave, 2014. And I'm the last person to say that they didn't pop up in interesting places, interesting in inverted commas, that they didn't attract attention to themselves. But I'm also the last person to say that they staged a wave of terrorist attacks in the West. Now, obviously, this is a completely different ballgame, because it's so, it's bigger, it's more intense, and yes, stuff like that. but I'm not sure, I remember he was actually fighting for the other side, but I think, he was coming from the far right milieu, and, French guy. And I spoke to him, and he said, and I was asking him, like, what's your plan next? Because you hate the West so much, you hate the social liberal arrangements. Did you consider political violence? The kind of like a ridiculous question. And but I was curious, like, what's his kind of like flavor? And he said to me, look, I'm not interested in that. And my people, as he said, are not interested in that, because we will lose. Because we have no chance. Because the state is so huge, it surveils us. It goes after us, etc., 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 that I'm just not going to do this. And they didn't, largely. They did other things. And yes, they are a security concern, but I'm not sure. Yes, and as as some people say, they're going to come back and they're going to be a strain on our welfare, provision, and they'll have PTSD and stuff like. Yeah, that's probably a worry. But is it a systemic worry that there's going to be like a whole generation of people with that? And yet, Amar, the big question: what are the numbers that we're going to deal with? I think other foreign fighter mobilizations or foreign volunteer mobilizations didn't break us. I'm not sure this one will. But it's a nice talking point, to kind of, especially to compare it with foreign fighter mobilizations for a completely different part of the world, which dominated the discussion on the issue, and rightly so, for the throughout the last decade. You almost like some colleagues sometimes extrapolate the situation there to the Ukrainian one, and it's different. It's not an ideological mobilization. Of course, the one for Syria wasn't that ideological at first as well. It was humanitarian, but I don't think this one's gonna get that ideological. It's relatively, it's kind of, I would say, I don't want to say it's romantic. Every which of these organizations are, is romantic, but there's a lot of resetting here. I want to mean something, and it's kind of, I'm going to a European country. I'm from Europe, so I'm just going to go back home. I'm not going to something which is so much different. Of course, it is different because it's war, but I'm thinking it's closer. They don't have to travel that far. I know for some people, Donetsk was way further than Damascus, but geographically, it is closer. And I wonder to what extent, the Middle Eastern comparison applies. As I said, I understand the fear that people are going to travel to and to fight and come back. In certain countries it's illegal because of that very reason at all. Not just foreign terrorist fighters, but also foreign fighters. So I understand that, but I'll come back to this. It's the dinner versus dessert type of a conversation.
I mean, the other concern, aside from the ideology or aside from, coming back home to launch attacks, etc., is they could commit war crimes while over there. They could be captured. So if you're a Canadian government, what do you do with somebody who left, who's now in custody of the Russian government, for example? Or you have the famous case of Craig Lang, the American military guy who I think joined the right sector and committed war crimes, and then I think was arrested on those issues as well, right? And so you have a foreigner going into a context he doesn't understand, probably doesn't understand the law that well, and you have them committing, war crimes on foreign soil. What does that mean legally? And so are you worried about that side of things as well, and not just kind of the ideology?
Yes, it's the size of it. If we're talking individual cases, I think every state will manage that. If it was huge, then that's a different ball game. But again, I don't think that's going to be the case. But I remember talking to some of them and asking about the war crimes issue and stuff like that. And then you're basically contributing to something which is not yours, and you shouldn't be here. That kind of an argument. And I remember being told, and maybe you heard that as well. They were saying like, "Oh, the violence would be there anyway, so I'm helping out." That's that's the line that they were they were deploying. Again, from the point of view of the government, of course, you don't want your lawyers to be chasing some guy sitting in some Russian jail. Absolutely, I mean, I understand, and I again understand. But obviously, what I hear from Ukrainians is that's the best line. So if you don't want to give us your fighters, then give us your fighter jets. And, you know, so that's really the conversation we're going to be having. So, you know, it would be, you know, wrong of me to say, no, I am not concerned. No, of course, you know, but you see, Amar, we had a decade or more to work out the policy on foreign fighters, not foreign terrorist fighters. And we didn't. No. It's still gray area, largely, in most of the countries. And I think on the back of, you know, all the ISIS experiences, it was a perfect chance to settle that, to say, okay, we're okay with our guys going. No, we're not. And if you go, then you get this. And this is what we're going to do. Stuff like that. We didn't do this because there was always the excuse, oh, we're busy with the jihadists. You know, and I heard it a trillion times. I mean, like officials from all around Europe saying, yeah, but the numbers so far are so low. So we just kind of shrug. And suddenly, you know, the numbers are potentially huge, although probably they're not going to be that big. And everybody's like, you know, scratching their heads. So, you know, probably a bit of soul searching is needed amongst the officials who are worried about these issues, you know.
Yeah, I mean, that's something I've been ranting about online and offline for probably a decade.
I wanted to provoke you.
I'm curious whether you're seeing or whether you anticipate a similar number of foreign fighters on the pro-Russian kind of separatist side, because that's not something that usually you see covered in the media really either. You see a lot of talk about Ukrainian people going into the Ukraine, but I know you've interviewed people on the pro-Russian side as well. I mean, what do the numbers look like on that side? What are we likely to see this time around?
I think so. I'll start with this time around because that's the easiest, Amar. Hardly anybody, because, you know, how do you get to Russia now? You know, there are no planes, there are no connections.
Yeah.
You know, I don't know. There's like a few countries from which you can actually fly. Plus, you know, if you really read you listen to what Russian TV is saying and what the social media, what's on the social media, they actually kind of hate the West, like big time. We're not needed at all. We're just a fallen power, broadly speaking, the kind of, you know, North Atlantic, transatlantic West. And the idea of now deploying people from that very hated and like not needed West to fight, I think you would have to go through some kind of verbal and visual gymnastics. But of course, Russians are allegedly masters of this. But, you know, why? What's the added value now? But in the past, numbers-wise, there was actually, you know, 2014 onwards, there were more people from the West, and then generally on the pro-Russian side, because, you know, they were fueled by this anti-Americanism, either far right or far left, saying, you know, I'm going to go, I'll make a stand against the American imperialism. That was the main kind of fuel. At the end of the day, they might be neo-Nazi and then you know, communist, but they were beautiful coming together, and they did. But again, the biggest group was the Russians. You know, they turned the tide in a way in 2014, or contributed to that, but now it's the Russian army. I mean, what I heard is that the Russian army is trying to sign up people in exchange for citizenship. So, you know, there's plenty of Central Asians in Russia, and I love it. You know, when the European far right says that Russia is anti-Muslim, this is just gold, or it's kind of like, you know, it's the real deal. It's white and stuff like that. And now Russia will be turning to Central Asians, which it has in its borders, and will be offering them citizenship in exchange for fighting in the ranks of the army. So there are stories like that breaking now, coming out from different places. But these are not foreign fighters; they're basically foreign recruits. In this sense, they will probably deploy mercenaries. They are, if the war turns, you know, long term, you know, goes long term, they would probably, yes, turn to militias. But, you know, militias of meaning some Eastern Europe, Eastern Ukrainian detachment, saying that it's fighting for Russian Ukraine and stuff like that. They might improvise with some post-Soviet things from their own borders, but for now, maybe they're going to get a few Serbs. They can fly them over and then try to dress them up as a kind of like some kind of an international brigade. But very limited possibilities at the moment.
If you could think of like top 3 mistakes that kind of journalists and analysts and researchers are making currently about this issue, or blind spots that you're seeing either on social media or in writing, what do you think those are?
I think the first one is the Nazi argument. Is Ukraine Nazi? And and slash, are all the fighters who are supposed to arrive, are they Nazis? That is just that's the probably spot 1 and 2. That's definitely something there. I think the second one is the kind of unease of some of the colleagues that this is state, but is it really state? Why wouldn't the state fight better? Why does it need this? And I think it's a kind of like lack of appreciation that this is basically in a way a cry of desperation. That's this thing. So I think these are the top ones, but then obviously there is stuff connected to the also some of the narrative of the other side in relation to for example, I heard reading stuff today that President Zelensky is a member of a far-right party, and then Jewish. Interesting, that kind of the framing, the attempts to frame that, to bend that towards a very specific thing. Plus, sometimes the interesting things are how it's organized. That apparently it's this kind of almost like a conveyor belt type of an operation, but I'm a Central Eastern European, and I know nothing's a conveyor belt. There's a lot of chaos and improvisation on the way, and we don't really have our eyes into certain things across the border. Even the safe spaces in Western Ukraine, or safer spaces in Western Ukraine, which are for now beyond the conflict. So I think we know very little of what's happening in the West. What forces the Ukrainians are amassing, training and stuff like that. We don't know that. We sometimes get the feeling that we know more about the Russian troops and how many of them were committed, which is great. Then we know in this spot where those fighters are supposedly, being launched from. That is one thing. And all these discussions on, so much of it centers on Kyiv, and so little centers on the southern front and the eastern, and they are key because they really cannot break, to be honest with you. And some of these fighters might be sent there, to be honest with you. Everybody asks me about Azov. Azov is in Mariupol, southeast of Ukraine. They are in danger of being encircled. And everyone talks to me about, their ideology, yet no one spares a thought about the fact that, they might be doomed, in a few days, in a war in which, I get it, I get it that NATO isn't a force in this, but like almost everyone from NATO donates something. So, shouldn't we be cheering for the whole setup on the Ukrainian side and settle these ideological differences and then disputes and debates later? And I understand that some people are concerned, these fighters will be then made into heroes. Yeah, probably, but what if that's true? Some of them just might become heroes. And like, to be honest with you, for example, Azov gets out alive of Mariupol. Well, that is a feat, to be honest with you. So it really shifts certain things, yet we're stuck in these lanes. And I think, for Ukrainians, the table at which we were sitting and playing bridge, it's been overturned twice. That's a completely different ballgame now.
I'll let you go after this one quick question, but there's been some controversy in Canada. I spoke to you about this before, about this black and red flag of the UPA appearing at pro-Ukrainian rallies, which has then led to questions about ideological commitment of some of these people at these rallies and so on. Our minister, Krista Freeland, was photographed with one of these flags or something, and then she got into a little bit of trouble for that. How do you interpret this old kind of UPA flag reappearing in some of these protests?
I think, it's the end story. You know, it's a backstory, maybe not a backstory. It's a kind of like a byproduct of the diasporas. That the diasporas that you, for example, some of it that you have in Ukraine, or Germany, Netherlands, other places, they were the diasporas of the Ukrainian nationalists who were escaping the Red Army in the after 1945. Some of them, pretty radical guys. Then, I'm not saying that every member of the diaspora in Canada is like that, but you will have elements like it. It's not the diaspora that Poland has, which is a new diaspora. Like, young people who don't know what the Ukrainian insurgent army is. Like, honestly, like my students, 20-year-olds, whom you would, from Western Ukraine, like, whom you would expect to be completely pumped up with all the stuff they were clueless. They were absolutely, and I was very happy with that, to be honest with you. But you would have this amongst the diasporas. This is a kind of a rallying cry. That's also like a two-fingered salute to the Russians, or a one-fingered salute, the middle finger, depending on how you look at it. They know it's a red tag to the bull, and you probably didn't get the memo PR-wise. And they're not happy when you actually say it, because then they're going to tell you that you're some kind of Western softie, and stuff like that, where they're the real deal. And that there's a lot of this kind of signaling here, a lot of smoke, but less fire. But I mean, I'm that's not something that I would condone. But just look at how it looks now in Ukraine, at the troops, what flags they're flying, what colors they've got, what's the imagery, what's the graphics. They even have the bloody yellow armband to identify themselves as Ukrainian. They don't have a black and red. So it's a kind of, I don't want to say it's irrelevant, but it's always worrying, because I'm no fan of this. But I would say I'll shrug. Of course, it's not great for a minister to be photographed with this, and she should know better by now, given the fact how many Ukrainians are in Canadian borders. To be honest with you, there should be a better brief, and there should be a blue and yellow scarf that she could hold. That would be, and then you can have what you want in the back. Who cares? As long as you're holding the right one. But I'm sure she'll know now.
Great. Thanks a lot for your time, Kacper. I know it's getting late over there, so I'll let you go. But that was very very useful, and I hope we can keep the conversation going. So thanks again.
Super, Amar. Thank you for having me.